The damp Georgia air tasted like old copper and wet moss. I stood by the open grave, the hem of my cheap black coat dragging in the Savannah mud. Garrison Vance, my adoptive father, was finally under the dirt. 7 years. 7 years of wiping his chin, listening to the same 3 broken memories, and watching a brilliant mind dissolve into gray mist. I gave up my entire 20s for him. No regrets. Just bone-deep fatigue. Then came the clicking of heels on wet gravel. Expensive heels. Gavin and Chloe. The biological bloodline. The ghosts who couldn't find Savannah on a map for 7 years had suddenly arrived in tailored black silk. Behind them, carrying a sleek leather briefcase, was Thomas Pierce, a lawyer whose smile always looked like a threat. Gavin didn't look at the casket. He looked past it, up at the hill where Whispering Pines sat. $15 million of historic antebellum architecture, commanding the riverbank. "Wrap it up, Amelia," Chloe whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint and expensive gin. "The rain is ruining my hair. And we have business." They didn't even wait for the dirt to settle. Half an hour later, we were crowded into the mansion's grand library. The scent of old leather and mahogany felt suffocating. Thomas Pierce unzipped his briefcase with a crisp mechanical snap. "An amendment," Pierce said, sliding a thick document across the heavy desk. "Signed 8 years ago, before your situation with Mr. Vance's mental health became official." I didn't reach for it. I already knew what it said. Gavin leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. His eyes were bloodshot, the unmistakable mark of a man who spent his weekends sweating over margin calls and bad stock options. "Everything goes to the bloodline, sis. The trust funds. The corporate shares. The offshore liquid assets. You get a thank you note. Maybe." "He had severe cognitive decline 8 years ago," I said. My voice was a flat line. No tremor. No tears. Chloe laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that rattled the crystal decanter on the side table. "Prove it. The medical records from that year are, let's say, ambiguous. Dad knew who his real children were. You were just the charity case he took in to feel better about his taxes." They expected me to scream. They wanted me to threat a lawsuit. A lawsuit meant a public scene, and a public scene meant they could paint me as a bitter, money-hungry outsider in the Savannah courts. I looked at the signature on the paper. It was shaky, a man being guided by a firm hand. I looked up, meeting Gavin's arrogant stare. I let a long, slow breath out through my nose. I saw their greed. It was a physical thing pulsing in the room. They wanted it all. They wanted it now. And more than anything, they wanted to see me broken. I stayed quiet. The trap needs quiet to be set. The next morning, the humiliation became a public spectacle. I didn't even have time to finish my coffee. The front doors of Whispering Pines were thrown open, admitting the suffocating heat of a Georgia morning, and 3 local freelance reporters with cameras. Chloe stood in the rotunda, flanked by 2 burly men from a cheap moving company. "Toss it," Chloe ordered, pointing a manicured finger toward the grand staircase. "All of it." Before I could stand, my life was thrown down. My old canvas duffel bags. My books on advanced financial risk management. A wooden box of my father's old fountain pens. They didn't just move them. They dumped them onto the wet gravel driveway, right in front of the flashing cameras. "Local charity case evicted from Vance estate," Gavin muttered, reading a text on his phone, likely checking the headline he'd leaked to the Savannah Ledger. He walked up to me, standing close enough that I could smell his expensive musk cologne. "You've got 10 minutes, Amelia. Before I have the sheriff remove you for trespassing." The reporters moved closer, lenses clicking like ravenous insects. They wanted a breakdown. They wanted to see the adoptive daughter weep in the mud, begging for a piece of the Vance empire. I walked out onto the porch. The air was thick, heavy with rain. I looked down at my belongings scattered in the dirt. A reporter thrust a microphone toward my face. "Amelia, do you feel betrayed by the Vance family after years of full-time caretaking?" I looked directly into the camera lens. My expression remained entirely neutral, cool, detached. The face of a woman looking at a ledger, not a tragedy. "The law is the law," I said clearly. "My siblings have made their position very clear. If they believe this property is their right, then they should have it. I won't stand in the way of family. Gavin sneered from the doorway, leaning against the grand white columns. Smart girl. Save yourself the legal fees. You're going to need every dime for rent. I knelt down in the dirt, carefully picking up my father's fountain pens. My hands were perfectly steady. I looked back up at the massive facade of Whispering Pines, the beautiful, decaying, ancient monster of a house. You're right, Gavin, I murmured, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of my lips as I locked eyes with him. This house, this name, it truly belongs to people like you now. He frowned, a brief flicker of confusion crossing his face at my calm, but his arrogance swallowed it whole. He turned his back on me, walking inside to claim his kingdom. They thought it was over. They thought they had won the war before the first shot was fired. But 3 hours later the paradigm shifted. I was sitting in a dim diner 3 blocks from the courthouse, sipping black coffee that tasted like burnt dirt, when my phone rang. It was Thomas Pierce. The arrogant, smooth tone from the library was completely gone. His voice was taut, vibrating at a frequency of pure panic. Amelia, we need to meet. Now. I'm busy looking for a place to sleep, Thomas, I replied, my voice dripping with deliberate exhaustion. The diner on Liberty Street. 10 minutes, he snapped and hung up. When he arrived, he didn't look like the polished corporate shark from the funeral. His tie was slightly askew. A bead of sweat was rolling down his temple, despite the blasting air conditioning. He slid into the booth across from me, slamming a heavy manila folder onto the Formica table. You knew, he hissed, his eyes darting around the diner. Knew what, Thomas? The title to Whispering Pines, he whispered, leaning in so close I could see the broken capillaries in his nose. It's not part of the estate. Your father didn't own it when he died. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Go on. An inter vivos deed, Pierce said, his voice trembling as he flipped open the folder. A gift made while living. Signed, notarized, and recorded 10 years ago. Garrison Vance transferred the entire deed of the mansion to you as an unconditional gift. The amendment we signed yesterday? It only covers assets held within the estate at the time of death. The house isn't in the estate. It's yours. Completely. Legally. I didn't blink. I had the original deed locked in a safety deposit box 5 miles away. I had known about it for a decade. So, I said quietly, Gavin and Chloe are currently occupying my private property. That sounds like a felony. Listen to me, Pierce said, his tone turning desperate. If you file an eviction, it creates a massive scandal. The Vance Group's stock will plummet. Gavin has millions tied up in short options right now. A scandal will ruin him. And Chloe? She's closing a marriage contract with a real estate family in Atlanta. If this gets out, the Vance name is mud. And why should I care? Because if you play ball, we can settle this quietly, Pierce said, trying to regain his footing, trying to play the manipulator. Gavin and Chloe are willing to buy you out. A quiet cash settlement. $1 million. You sign a quitclaim deed, transfer the house to them, and walk away. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch between us. $1 million for a $15 million historic estate. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it. They still thought they could bully me. They still thought they were the predators. No, I said. Pierce froze. Amelia, don't be stupid. $1 million is more than you'll ever make. I don't want their money, Thomas. I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave, turning ice cold. Tell Gavin and Chloe this. I am tired of fighting. I want peace. If they want the house so badly, I will give it to them. For free. A total gift. Pierce stared at me, his mouth slightly open. For free? What's the catch? No catch, I said, leaning forward, looking into his cynical soul. But it must be a conditional quitclaim deed. They must accept the property exactly as it stands, as is, with full assumption of any and all liabilities, encumbrances, or legal obligations tied to the land. I want my name scrubbed completely from that property by Friday at 3. Tell them it's my final offer. They get the mansion, no strings attached, and they never have to see my face again. Pierce's eyes lit up with the fatal spark of a salesman who thinks he's just found a sucker. A gift deed, with full liability assumption? You're giving away a $15 million asset because you're tired. I just want to be done with the Vance family, Thomas. He snatched the folder back, a predatory grin returning to his face. I'll have the paperwork drawn up by morning. You're making a massive mistake, Amelia. Perhaps, I murmured, watching him rush out of the diner. I looked down at my coffee. The bait was taken, and they were running toward it full speed. The office smelled of stale vinegar and burnt dust from a baseboard heater that had no business being on in May. I chose Miller's Legal Services on the absolute ass end of Montgomery Street for a reason. The linoleum floor was curling at the corners like old bacon, and the frosted glass on the door still had a shadow where someone had scraped off the word divorce 10 years ago. It was the perfect stage. Gavin arrived first. He didn't sit. He paced the narrow strip of carpet between the water cooler and the laminate desk, his fingers twitching against the screen of his phone. Every 12 seconds, a soft chime signaled another fluctuation in the market. Every chime made his jaw tighten a little more. He was bleeding cash out there in the real world, and this room was his tourniquet. Chloe came in 3 minutes later, bringing the humidity of the street with her. She looked at the plastic chairs, made a small sound of disgust in the back of her throat, and remained standing near the door, her leather bag held against her chest like a shield. Thomas Pierce followed, looking deeply uncomfortable in a $3,000 suit that was entirely too heavy for a Savannah summer. "You're late, Amelia," Gavin said. He didn't look up from his screen. "We have 3 other closings today. Real ones. Not charity handouts." I didn't answer right away. I sat behind the small metal desk, wearing a faded gray cardigan 3 sizes too big for me. I kept my shoulders slumped, my hands tucked into the sleeves, hiding the steady rhythm of my pulse. I had spent 48 hours straight looking at their personal debt structures. I knew exactly how much pressure was behind their eyes. "I had to walk," I said, keeping my voice small, thick with a rehearsed tremor. "The oil pan on my car is leaking. I couldn't get it started." Chloe let out a short, sharp breath. "Jesus. This is exactly why we needed to clear the air. The Vance name doesn't belong in a scrapyard, Amelia. You're dragging down the family brand every day you linger in this town." "I don't want to drag anything down," I whispered. I looked down at my lap, letting a long, ragged exhale pass through my lips. I spent 7 years watching Dad disappear. 7 years. By the end, he didn't even know his own name. But he knew yours. He kept asking why you didn't call. "Don't start with the guilt trip," Gavin snapped, his voice cracking slightly. He finally shoved the phone into his pocket. The old man was gone before the ink dried on the trust reorganization. "You got a free ride for 7 years while we were out building the actual business. Now where's the deed?" I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out a single manila folder. It was slightly crumpled at the edge, a deliberate touch. I laid it on the desk but kept my palm flat against it, pretending to hesitate. "Thomas said you'd offer $1 million, I murmured, looking up at Pierce. "I don't want it. If I take your money, you'll tell everyone I extorted you. You'll put things in the papers. You'll say I used Dad's sickness to steal from his bloodline." Chloe crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Then what do you want, Amelia? Because nobody gives away $15 million of prime historic real estate out of the goodness of their heart. What's the play?" "I want an NDA," I said, my voice rising just enough to sound desperate. "A total ironclad non-disclosure agreement. You sign a statement saying I cared for Garrison Vance with full honor and integrity. You agree never to release any stories about my adoption or my status in the family to the press. In exchange, you get the house. For $0. A clean gift." Gavin looked at Pierce. Pierce shrugged, the tension in his shoulders dropping an inch. A free house meant Gavin could leverage the equity by Tuesday morning to cover his bad shorts. It meant Chloe's future in-laws would see her as the rightful heir to the grandest estate on the river. "A gift deed," Pierce said, stepping forward and pulling a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket. "Let me see the draft." I slid the folder across the laminate. My hand shook just enough to make the paper rustle. A standard corporate lawyer is trained to look for large, obvious knives. They look for hidden mortgages, IRS liens, or secondary claims from disgruntled relatives. They check the county recorder's index. They verify the chain of title, and if the line is straight, they consider the job done. Thomas Pierce was a standard lawyer. He was greedy, he was tired, and he despised being in a room that smelled like old vinegar. He flipped open my draft of the conditional quitclaim deed. I watched his eyes move across the lines, skipping the boilerplate text to find the core covenants. He was looking for a trick, a hidden payout, a reserved life estate that would let me stay in the guest house, or a first right of refusal clause. He found none of that. Instead, his eyes lingered on Section 4. Grantee accepts the real property known as Whispering Pines in its absolute, as is condition, assuming any and all latent defects, environmental mandates, historical encumbrances, and municipal, state, or federal liabilities currently attached or subsequently discovered, without recourse against the grantor. Standard as is language, Pierce muttered, tapping the page with the back of his gold pen. A bit broad on the federal side, but given the age of the structure, that's expected. You're waiving your right to any post-closing claims. I want nothing to do with it, I said, leaning my head against my hand, looking thoroughly defeated. The roof leaks in the north wing. The foundation has a shifting issue that costs $20,000 just to survey. I can't afford the property taxes by July. If I keep it, the state will take it anyway. I'd rather it be your problem. Gavin let out a dry scoff. Hear that? $20,000 for a survey and she's ready to fold. This is what happens when you don't have business blood, Amelia. You see a hill, you think it's a mountain. The language seems clean, Pierce said, turning to the final page. But there's an indemnification clause here. Grantee shall hold harmless and indemnify grantor from any third-party financial obligations arising from properties cross-collateralized under historical corporate entities. What's this referring to? My heart didn't skip a beat. I had practiced this specific answer 40 times in front of my bathroom mirror. Dad had an old shell company, I said, keeping my tone perfectly dull, almost bored. Vance. Heritage Holdings LLC. He used it to buy the antique furniture in the main parlor back in '94. The company has been dissolved for years, but the bank never cleared the UC filing on the sofas. I don't want some collector coming after my bank account for an old leather couch. Pierce smiled. It was that small patronizing grin older men give to women they think are entirely out of their depth. He looked at Gavin and gave a curt nod. It's a standard cleanup clause for old personal property liens. Nothing to worry about. The land itself is clear. Checked it this morning. He didn't check the Federal Heritage Conservation Registry. He couldn't. The registration had been filed under a Restricted Emergency Conservation Act that doesn't hit the public county database until the mandatory 72-hour administrative processing window closes. And I had timed that window to the minute. Let's get the notary, Gavin said, pulling his chair out with a loud scrape. I have a flight to Atlanta at 5, and I'm not spending another second in this hole. The notary was an elderly woman named Martha who smelled faintly of mothballs and menthol cigarettes. She came in from the back room, her thick glasses distorting her eyes until she looked like an owl. She didn't care about the $15 million house, or the tension vibrating between the 4 people in her office. She only cared about the stamps. IDs, she rasped, setting down a heavy cast iron seal with a thud that felt like a gavel. Gavin threw his driver's license onto the desk. Chloe slid hers over with 2 fingers, as if touching the laminate might contaminate her. I placed mine down quietly. The wall clock above the water cooler had a rhythmic mechanical click. Tick. 2:52 p.m. Pierce adjusted the documents, laying out 3 identical copies of the conditional quitclaim deed. Sign at the tabs, Gavin. Then Chloe. Amelia signs last as the grantor. Gavin grabbed the cheap plastic pen from the desk. He signed his name with 3 massive, violent strokes, tearing the edge of the signature page slightly. Done, he said, tossing the pen toward his sister. Chloe didn't use the cheap pen. She pulled a slender, silver rollerball from her purse, signed her name with an elegant, practiced cursive flourish, and then looked at me. Your turn, sis. Sign over the keys and go find yourself a nice small apartment. Somewhere far away from the river. I reached out of my oversized sleeve. I took the cheap pen Gavin had discarded. My fingers didn't shake now. The weakness was gone, replaced by the cool, hard precision that had pulled me through 7 years of isolation. I signed Amelia Vance 3 times. Martha took the papers, checked the dates, and lifted her heavy iron seal. Clack. The first stamp hit the paper, the sound echoing off the thin walls of the office. Clack. The second. Clack. The third. "You're all set," Martha said, sliding the copies into separate folders. "Have a nice weekend." I looked up at the clock. 3 p.m. Exactly 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. In the state of Georgia, the county clerk's office locks its doors at 3 for the weekend. The Federal Courier office down the street stops accepting manual overrides at the exact same minute. The documents were executed, the title had transferred, and the legal reality of Whispering Pines was now firmly, irrevocably locked in their hands. Gavin stood up, not offering a hand, not looking at me. "Pierce, file those first thing Monday morning. Chloe, call the decorators. Tell them we want the entire East Wing gutted by next weekend." They walked out of the office without another word. The heavy glass door swung shut, the shadow of the old divorce sign passing over their faces one last time before they vanished into the glare of the Montgomery Street sun. I stayed in my chair for a long time. The heater gave one final dying click and went silent. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I had kept on speed dial for 6 months. It didn't ring twice. "Marcus," I said, my voice no longer small, no longer trembling. "The deeds are stamped. They signed the as-is with full liability." On the other end of the line, the old lawyer let out a short, cold chuckle. "Good girl. I'll notify the Federal Preservation Board to release the classification notice. Have a good weekend, Amelia. Monday morning is going to be very loud." The air in room 114 of the Quality Inn out on Interstate 95 smelled of industrial pine cleaner and old cigarettes. I liked it. It was clean, predictable, and cost exactly $84 a night. I sat on the edge of the polyblend mattress, the blue light of my laptop reflecting off the cheap plastic wood of the desk. On the screen, Savannah's high society was putting on a show. Chloe couldn't help herself. By Saturday night, her Instagram story was a non-stop feed of sparkling crystal, linen shirts, and the heavy golden glow of Whispering Pines. She had geotagged the mansion with 3 words. "Finally home again." I zoomed in on one video. The grand ballroom, the one with the hand-blocked wallpaper from 1840, was packed. 200 people were jammed under the crystal chandelier, sweating through their silk dresses while a 4-piece jazz band blew brass into the humid air. Gavin was near the mahogany bar, his face flushed red from scotch, laughing with a group of local maritime executives. He was probably already pitching them on the equity loan he was going to pull out of my father's house by Tuesday. They were celebrating my eviction. They were toasting the charity case who broke under pressure. But if you looked closely at the background of Chloe's videos, you could see it. When the bass from the speakers hit a certain frequency, the long vertical cracks near the crown molding didn't just sit there. They vibrated. At one point, a waiter in a tuxedo stepped too close to the east wall, and a tiny pale puff of lime plaster dust drifted down onto his shoulder like dandruff. The house was 200 years old. It was built on tidal mud and ballast stone. It didn't like noise. It didn't like 200 drunk socialites stamping their heels on heart pine joists that had been dry rotting since the Hoover administration. I closed the laptop. The silence of the motel room rushed back in. I lay down, staring at the textured ceiling, listening to the semi-truck's engine braking on the highway miles away. Eat, drink, and be merry, Gavin. You've got about 18 hours left. Sunday afternoon brought the hangover. It also brought a white Ford Taurus with federal government plates. I wasn't on the property, but the private investigator I'd hired to sit in a parked van across the river sent the high-definition feed straight to my phone. At 2:14 p.m., the heat was hovering around 94 degrees. The party guests were gone, leaving the lawn littered with crushed plastic cups and wilted catering flowers. 2 people got out of the Taurus, a middle-aged woman in a sensible beige pantsuit and a younger man carrying a heavy Nikon DSLR with a telephoto lens and a yellow steel measuring tape. Dr. Evelyn Vance, no relation to us, just a beautiful coincidence, was the senior field director for the National Historic Landmarks program. They walked up the driveway, their boots crunching on the gravel. The photographer didn't wait. He started clicking. He took shots of the Greek Revival columns, the hand-forged iron railings, the slight dip in the eastern roofline. Gavin came out onto the porch 3 minutes later. He was wearing a wrinkled silk robe, his hair sticking up on one side, holding a mug of coffee like a weapon. Even from the low-res stream, I could see the veins in his neck bulging. "Hey!" Gavin shouted, his voice cutting through the heavy cicada drone of the swamp. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Get that camera out of here." Dr. Evelyn didn't flinch. She pulled a laminated federal badge from her pocket and held it out. "Mr. Vance? I'm with the Department of the Interior. We're here to conduct the final structural and material audit for the Whispering Pines Historic Designation." Gavin didn't take the badge. He didn't even look at it. He stepped down off the porch, his bare feet hitting the hot gravel, his arms swinging wildly. "I don't care if you're with the Pope. This is private property. We closed on the transfer Friday. My name is on the goddamn deed." "Exactly," Dr. Evelyn said, her voice cool, professional, and entirely unimpressed by a man in a bathrobe. "And as the new record owner, you are fully subject to the emergency conservation filing submitted 3 weeks ago by the previous trustee. The administrative hold expired at 3 o'clock Friday, Mr. Vance. The designation is active." Gavin snatched the clipboard out of her hand. He stared at the top sheet, his jaw dropping so fast I thought it might hit his chest. He shook his head, his face turning from a hangover gray to a dangerous mottled purple. "This is bullshit," he screamed, ripping the top page off the clipboard and crumpling it into a ball. "Amelia did this. That crazy bitch did this. Get off my land before I get my gun." The photographer didn't stop. Click, click, click. He caught every second of it. Dr. Evelyn gently took her clipboard back from Gavin's twitching fingers. "Arguing with a federal officer during a mandated inspection carries a $5,000 fine, Mr. Vance. And destroying federal notification paperwork is a misdemeanor. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 9 with a marshal escort. Have a nice day." They walked back to the Taurus, leaving Gavin standing in the dirt, the crumpled paper rolling past his bare feet like a piece of high-end tumbleweed. I flipped through the secondary document on my screen, the one Thomas Pierce had called standard cleanup language for an old sofa. Vance Heritage Holdings LLC. My father hadn't used that company to buy antique furniture in 1994. That was just the lie I fed Pierce to keep him from digging into the Delaware State Registry. In reality, 3 years ago, when the first signs of Dad's dementia began to turn into paranoia, I used Vance Heritage Holdings to restructure the private debt on the estate. I took out a $5 million mortgage against the physical bricks of Whispering Pines. But the lender wasn't Chase or Wells Fargo. The lender was an offshore asset-backed fund called Blackwood Trust, and who owned 100% of Blackwood Trust through an anonymous blind trust in South Dakota. Me. For 3 years I had been paying interest to myself, keeping the loan perfectly active, perfectly legal. But there was a specific venomous little clause hidden deep within page 47 of that mortgage agreement. A clause known in high-stakes corporate law as a cross-collateralization technical default. The terms were simple. If the property securing the $5 million loan ever suffered a material adverse change in legal status, such as, say, being declared a federal disaster zone, or being placed under a restricted historic landmark designation that stripped away its commercial market value, the entire $5 million became due immediately. And because Gavin and Chloe had signed that conditional quitclaim deed, because they had eagerly accepted the property as is with full assumption of all historical and corporate liabilities, that $5 million debt didn't belong to the estate anymore. It jumped. Like a parasite looking for a warmer host, the mortgage attached itself directly to their personal financial signatures. The $5 million was now guaranteed by Gavin's personal trading accounts and Chloe's trust funds. They thought they had stripped me of my father's legacy in that library. They thought they had left me with nothing but a broken car and a cheap suitcase. I looked out the small window of the Quality Inn. The sun was dipping below the tree line, turning the Georgia sky the color of a bruised plum. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Marcus. "The federal injunction has been signed by the district judge. Court date set for tomorrow morning 10 a.m. We're something nice, Amelia." I picked up my glass of lukewarm motel tap water and took a sip. "Cheers, Gavin," I whispered to the empty room. "See you in court." Monday morning in Savannah doesn't wake up. It crawls out of the swamp heavy, slick, and smelling of low tide. At 8:45 a.m., I was parked half a mile down the river road under the heavy shade of a weeping live oak. The air conditioning in my rented Chevy sedan was blowing a weak, warm breeze that tasted of dust. I had a lukewarm paper cup of gas station coffee in the cup holder, and a pair of old Nikon binoculars in my lap. Through the cracked windshield I watched the river road. Exactly 9 o'clock. The cicadas in the brush suddenly went quiet as two black Chevrolet Suburbans cruised past my hideout. They weren't speeding. They moved with the slow, terrifying confidence of institutional weight. Government plates. Clean black gloss coated in a layer of yellow Georgia pollen. I put the car in gear and followed at a distance, letting two logging trucks stay between us. When the Suburbans pulled through the iron gates of Whispering Pines, they didn't stop in the visitor lot. They drove right onto the manicured clover lawn, their heavy Michelin tires tearing deep, muddy ruts into the sod. The identical doors clicked open in unison. 4 men and 2 women stepped out. No bathrobes this time. Dark gray suits. Federal badges clipped to their belts. 2 United States Marshals stood by the front bumpers, their hands resting loosely near their holsters. Gavin came out on the porch in his undershirt, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lip. His face was the color of curdled milk. "Hey, the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice cracking across the humid air. "I told that woman yesterday, this is private property." The lead agent, a man with a gray buzz cut and a thick leather folder under his arm, didn't answer. He walked up the stone steps, took a single sheet of heavy vellum from the folder, and pressed it directly against Gavin's sweaty chest. "Gavin Vance." The agent's voice was a flat Midwestern drone that carried perfectly across the lawn. "I'm Special Agent Miller, Department of the Interior. You're being served with an emergency administrative injunction under Title 54 of the United States Code." Gavin looked at the paper, then at the marshals. The cigarette dropped from his mouth, landing on the porch floor with a tiny hiss. "This is a joke," Gavin stammered, backing up toward the door. "Chloe, get Pierce on the phone right now." "No joke, Mr. Vance," Agent Miller said, stepping into the grand foyer without asking. "Your sister's little party on Saturday night had 3 catering trucks parked over the original 1845 cistern system in the east courtyard. The weight cracked the brick vaulting underground. That structure is a protected architectural element under the National Historic Landmarks Program. You've already caused structural degradation to a Level 1 federal asset." Miller pulled a yellow grease pencil from his pocket and made a massive ugly X right across the polished mahogany front door. "First citation," Miller said. "Unauthorized modification and property damage to a landmark. Standard administrative fine. $100,000. Due in 14 days. Don't wipe that mark off, sir. That's a separate misdemeanor." By noon, the heat inside the house was probably worse than the heat outside. I knew because the private investigator's hidden microphone in the library was still live. I sat in my rental car, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the sound of paper ripping and glass breaking. "What do you mean we can't sell it?" Chloe's voice was a high-pitched shriek, vibrating with raw panic. "It's a house. People buy houses every day." "Not this one." Thomas Pierce's voice came through the speaker. The smooth, expensive corporate lawyer sounded like he was running out of oxygen. "The designation is absolute, Chloe. Under the Historic Sites Act, once a property hits Level 1 status with an active conservation mandate, it cannot be transferred, mortgaged, or sold until all outstanding structural deficiencies are cleared and certified by a federal engineer." "Then we tear it down," Gavin roared. I heard the distinct sound of a heavy crystal tumbler smashing against the brick fireplace. "We burn the bastard to the ground. Clear the lot. Sell the land to the riverfront developers. I've got 3 margin calls hitting my desk by 5 o'clock, Thomas. I need the equity from this land today. If this house burns," Pierce said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper, "the federal government assumes arson by the record owner. That's 5 years minimum in a federal penitentiary, Gavin. No parole. And look at page 4. Just look at the goddamn maintenance mandate." There was a long silence on the tape. The only sound was the heavy rhythmic thud of the library's ceiling fan. "The lime mortar," Pierce read out loud, his hand visibly shaking based on the rustle of the paper. "The exterior stucco is failing on the north facade. Because it's a Level 1 landmark, you cannot use modern Portland cement. It requires historically accurate oyster shell lime mortar, mixed by hand, applied by certified architectural conservators. Estimated cost for the facade alone, $3 million. $3 million. Chloe gasped. We don't have $3 million liquid. Dad's trust is tied up in the probate dispute. It gets worse, Pierce muttered. The sills under the ballroom are dry rotting. They require old-growth longleaf pine timbers. You can't buy them at Home Depot, Gavin. They have to be salvaged from pre-Civil War structures and certified by the department. The total restoration mandate list totals $8.2 million. Work must commence within 90 days. And if we don't? Gavin asked. The arrogance was completely gone from his voice now. He sounded small. Hello. $50,000, Pierce said. $50,000 for what? For every single day the property remains non-compliant after the 90-day grace period, Pierce whispered. And because you signed the as-is gift deed with full liability assumption. This isn't an estate debt. It's a personal judgment. They will freeze your personal trading accounts by Friday, Gavin. They'll put a lien on your Atlanta house, Chloe. Every asset you own is tied to these bricks now. The silence that followed was the prettiest thing I've ever heard. Then came the rot. When people are bound together by greed, they don't hold hands when the ship starts to sink. They use each other as life jackets. You told us it was clean. Gavin screamed. I heard the sound of a chair flipping backward. You're the lawyer, Pierce. You checked the title. You said the cleanup clause was just for an old leather couch. It was. Pierce yelled back, dropping his professional facade entirely. Amelia lied to us. She gave me a dissolved LLC name. How was I supposed to know she filed a restricted federal conservation petition under a South Dakota blind trust 3 weeks ago? It didn't hit the county computer until 3 o'clock Friday. You're supposed to know because we pay you to know, you incompetent piece of shit. Chloe screamed. I could hear her fingernails tapping furiously against the desk. You ruined me. I'm supposed to meet the Bramlett family for dinner tonight in Atlanta. If their lawyers see a federal lien on my credit report, the wedding is off. Fix this, Thomas. I can't fix it. Pierce shouted. The deed is recorded. You signed it willingly. You explicitly waived the right to a pre-closing inspection to speed up the transfer. You wanted her out so fast you didn't look at the fine print. She set us up, Gavin whispered. It was the first smart thing he'd said all week. The car. The old sweater. The crying about Dad. She wanted us to take the house. She gave it away for free because she knew the house was a bomb. Well, call her. Chloe yelled. Offer her the $1 million. Offer her $5 million. Tell her she can have the house back. She won't take it, Pierce said, his voice sounding completely drained. I know Amelia. She's not answering her phone. Her lawyer is Marcus Vance. Do you know who Marcus is? He spent 20 years as the chief counsel for the Senate Historic Preservation Subcommittee before he went into private practice. He wrote the very laws that are currently crushing your ribs. Through the phone speaker, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the library door. Get out, Gavin said to Pierce. Gavin, listen to me. I said get the fuck out of my house, Thomas, Gavin growled. Before I use what's left of my money to make sure you never practice law in this state again. A door slammed. Then the real show started. This is your fault. Chloe shrieked at her brother. You needed the equity for your bad shorts. You rushed the signature. You told me she was just a stupid charity case we could scare away. Shut up, Chloe. Gavin screamed back. You were the one who wanted the reporters there. You wanted to put her in the mud. Well, guess what? We're the ones in the mud now. And we're drowning. I clicked the phone off. I leaned my head back against the headrest of the rental car and looked up through the sunroof at the blue Georgia sky. The cicadas started up again, their long high whine filling the empty car. I took a slow sip of my cold coffee. Tasted perfect. The air inside courtroom 3B of the Savannah Federal Courthouse was thick with the smell of old wool, floor wax, and damp raincoats. The air conditioning was humming a low, vibrating B-flat that seemed to rattle the heavy oak wainscoting. High on the wall behind the bench, the brass seal of the United States District Court caught the harsh glare of the fluorescent tubes. At the plaintiff's table, Gavin's left shoe was tapping against the carpet. A frantic, irregular rhythm. Tap tap tap. He had chewed the skin around his thumbnail until it was raw and bleeding, leaving a small dark smudge on the collar of his shirt. Next to him, Chloe looked like she had aged 10 years since Saturday night. Her skin was a dull, powdery gray under the lights, her knuckles locked white around a shred of damp tissue. They had filed an emergency motion to rescind the deed. They were suing me for what their new lawyer called fraudulent concealment and bad faith asset dumping. They thought a federal judge would save them from their own stupidity. I sat at the defense table, my hands resting flat on the polished mahogany. I was wearing a sharp midnight black tailored suit I'd bought in New York 3 years ago. No jewelry. No makeup except for a swipe of dark lipstick. My spine was perfectly straight against the wooden back of the chair. Next to me sat Marcus Vance. He was 81, his hair the color of unpolished silver, his oversized hands resting on a battered leather briefcase that looked older than the courthouse itself. He hadn't spoken a word since we entered the room. He just sat there breathing slowly, smelling faintly of peppermint and old paper. Judge Thomas Albright stepped up to the bench. He didn't look at Gavin. He didn't look at me. He adjusted his glasses, looked down at the thick stack of motions, and let out a long, heavy sigh that sounded like a tire losing air. We are here on an emergency petition to stay enforcement of a federal conservation mandate and void a recorded transfer of real property, Albright said, his deep Georgia drawl dragging across the silent room. Mr. Vance, your counsel argues that the defendant, Amelia Vance, willfully misled you regarding the impending historic landmark status of the property, known as Whispering Pines. I've read the briefs, but I want to look at the paperwork. Gavin's new attorney, a frantic, sweat-stained man named Caldwell, leaped to his feet. Your Honor, my clients were ambushed. The defendant used their emotional vulnerability during a time of familial grief to dump a toxic asset containing millions of dollars in immediate federal liabilities. It's a classic bait and switch. I didn't move a muscle. I kept my eyes fixed on the seal on the wall. Let him talk. Let him dig the hole a little deeper. Marcus Vance didn't leap to his feet. When Caldwell finally ran out of breath and sat down, Marcus leaned forward, placed his palms on the edge of the table, and pushed himself up with a slow, deliberate grace. The room seemed to tilt toward him. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it had the heavy, resonant rumble of a church organ. Your Honor, Marcus said, turning a single page in his folder. There was no ambush. There was only an extraction. And the plaintiffs brought their own shovels. He walked over to the podium, his boots making a heavy, rhythmic sound on the linoleum. With a nod to the clerk, the projector on the ceiling groaned to life, casting a massive, bright image of the signature page against the white wall above the jury box. This is the conditional quitclaim deed executed by Gavin and Chloe Vance on Friday at exactly 2:52 p.m., Marcus said, pointing a long, weathered finger at the text. I draw the court's attention to Section 4. It is highlighted in yellow. It reads, Grantee accepts the property in its absolute, as is condition, assuming any and all latent defects, environmental mandates, historical encumbrances and municipal, state, or federal liabilities currently attached or subsequently discovered. Marcus paused. He turned around slowly, looking directly at Gavin, then at Chloe. His eyes were completely devoid of pity. The plaintiffs argue they were misled, Marcus continued, his voice dropping an octave, echoing off the high ceiling. But the record shows that on Friday morning, my client offered to give them 48 hours to review the document with independent structural engineers. It was Gavin Vance who refused. It was Chloe Vance who insisted on an immediate closing because they wanted my client off the property before the weekend. They wanted the prize. They wanted it before the market opened on Monday. They explicitly signed a waiver rejecting a pre-closing title search. Judge Albright leaned forward, his dark robes bunching around his shoulders. He looked at the document on the wall, then down at Caldwell. Is this accurate, counselor? Did your clients waive the standard title search window? Caldwell opened his mouth, closed it, and looked down at his yellow legal pad. He was out of juice. Your Honor, my clients are not real estate experts. But they are corporate executives, Marcus snapped, his voice suddenly cutting through the room like a whip. He didn't give Caldwell a chance to recover. They are professionals who understand that when you sign a document containing the words, full liability assumption, You are legally marrying whatever is behind that door. Marcus took 2 steps closer to the bench. The trap is sprung, Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried to the very back row of the gallery. They thought they were using a shaky amendment to strip an adoptive sister of her home. They thought they were cashing in on a $15 million asset for free. But by signing that as-is deed to escape a title search, they didn't just take the house. They legally accepted a $5 million cross-collateralized mortgage held by Blackwood Trust against that property. And because the federal landmark status constitutes a material adverse change in the asset's value, Blackwood Trust has officially triggered the default clause. The $5 million is due today, and it is personally guaranteed by the plaintiff's assets. Marcus sat down. The silence in the courtroom was so loud I could hear the tiny metallic click of Gavin's watch. Judge Albright didn't hesitate. He didn't even look at his law clerk. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel, his face set in a hard, grim line. The law in the state of Georgia is clear, Albright said, his voice coming down like a stone block. A contract signed by competent adults without evidence of physical duress is binding. You cannot plead ignorance of a clause you chose not to read because you were in a hurry to disinherit your sister. The motion to rescind is denied. The deed stands. Court is adjourned. Bang. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood was a gunshot. For a second nobody moved. Then a strange choked sound came from Chloe's throat. A low ragged gasp for air. Her eyes rolled back into her head, her fingers twitching as she slid completely out of her chair, hitting the carpeted floor with a dull, heavy thud. She had fainted cold. Caldwell yelled for water, leaning over her, but Gavin didn't look down at his sister. He didn't care. He stood up, his face contorted into an ugly purple mask of pure animal rage. The veins in his forehead were black lines under his skin. He looked across the well of the court at me. He didn't see the cheap cardigan anymore. He saw the architect. You bitch, Gavin roared, his voice bouncing off the brass seal behind the bench. He lunged forward, throwing his weight against the heavy mahogany railing that separated the lawyers from the gallery. You ruined me. You stole my father's company. I'll kill you. I'll burn that fucking house down with you inside it. He didn't make it 2 steps. The 2 U.S. Marshals who had been standing by the doors moved like linebackers. The larger one grabbed Gavin by the shoulder, twisting his arm behind his back with a sharp, sickening pop. The second Marshal drove his forearm into the back of Gavin's neck, slamming his face straight down onto the hard oak railing. Gavin's nose hit the wood with a wet, cracking sound. His glasses flew off, skidding across the linoleum floor into the corner. Down! Stay down! The Marshal barked, his knee driving into Gavin's lower back, pinning him to the floor. The metallic click-click-click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around Gavin's wrists echoed through the room. I stood up slowly. I smoothed down the front of my black suit jacket. I walked over to the railing, stepping over a drop of Gavin's blood that had splattered onto the wood. I leaned over, looking down at his face. His cheek was pressed hard against the carpet, his mouth twisted open, sucking in air through a bloody nose. Amelia! He wheezed, his eyes wide, bloodshot and wild with terror. Please. Dad gave you 7 years to visit, Gavin, I said. My voice was very quiet, very clear, meant only for him. He sat in that library every single Tuesday, looking out the window, waiting for your car to pull up the drive. You didn't come once. You were too busy with your margins. You were too busy counting your inheritance before he was even cold. I leaned in a fraction closer, my shadow falling over his face. This isn't my revenge, I whispered. I didn't force your hand. I didn't make you sign that paper. Your own greed did the writing, Gavin. You signed your own death warrant. Now pay the bill. I turned my back on him. I picked up my father's old leather briefcase, walked past Chloe's limp body, and followed Marcus Vance out through the heavy double doors into the bright, clean air of the Savannah morning. The federal machinery doesn't sweat. It just grinds, slow and heavy. 3 weeks after the hearing, the Chapter 7 bankruptcy filings hit the wire. Gavin and Chloe tried to liquidate everything to cover the $5 million default, but the Department of the Interior moved faster. A federal receiver took the keys to Whispering Pines. The iron gates were chained shut. A heavy weatherproof notice was padlocked to the bars, bearing the eagle seal of the United States. Under U.S. bankruptcy law, federal fines for historical degradation and debts incurred through willful negligence are non-dischargeable. They don't just go away. Chloe's engagement to the Atlanta real estate family vanished before the ink on the court transcript was dry. Her luxury condo in Buckhead was seized. The walk-in closets emptied into cardboard boxes by moving men who didn't care about designer labels. Gavin was transferred to a minimum security facility in Jessup, awaiting trial for felony assault. His trading accounts? Locked. His credit score? 0. They left the courthouse with 2 cardboard boxes of personal effects and a lifetime of federal debt. They were officially broken, and buried under the very paper they used as a weapon. By October, the suffocating heat of Savannah was a distant memory. I sat in a high-backed leather chair on the 42nd floor of a glass tower on Central Park South. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the New York trees looked like small splashes of rust and gold against the gray concrete below. The office was quiet. No humidity. No smell of old vinegar or wet mud. On the clean mahogany desk sat my father's old silver pocket watch. I picked it up, feeling the cool, scratched metal against my palm. I wound it slowly. Click, click, click. The steady, mechanical heartbeat filled the room. When the scandal hit the news, the Vance Group stock did exactly what I predicted. It hit the floor. Panicked creditors were practically begging to dump their shares. That's when Blackwood Trust stepped in. I used the liquidated cash from Gavin and Chloe's seized personal assets to buy out the remaining 70% of the company for pennies on the dollar. I didn't just save Garrison Vance's legacy from his biological bloodline. I bought it. The Vance Group belonged to me now. Every corporate share, every offshore account, every patent. I had taken back everything they tried to steal, and I did it using their own pens. People like to think that justice is loud. They think it involves screaming, smashed fists, and Hollywood endings. But in my world, justice is just a cold piece of math. It's a ledger that finally balances itself out. You don't need to hunt your enemies, and you don't need to break the law to break them. You just have to understand what makes them tick. People like Gavin and Chloe don't need an assassin. Their own greed is the only executioner they'll ever need. You just have to lay out the right contract, use the right ink, and step out of the way. When the hunger for more blinds a person to the fine print, a simple signature can turn a golden throne into a scaffold. I placed the pocket watch back on the desk, slipped my hands into my pockets, and looked out over the city. The sun was going down, casting long dark shadows across the park. The game was over. The account was settled. And the house, finally, was silent.